Great. Well, welcome, everyone. I'm Bobby Duffy. I'm Director of the Policy Institute at King's College London and Chair of the Campaign for Social Science, which is part of the Academy of Social Science. And it's a real genuine pleasure to welcome you to the campaign's key event of the year, the Campaign for Social Science and SAGE Annual Lecture. This year in partnership with Policy Institute and our Faculty of Social Sciences and Public Policy, and the Global Institute for Women's Leadership. And for those of you who don't know, the campaign exists to demonstrate how social science improves public policy, society and lives. Not just claiming that it does, but showing practically how it does. And to advocate for its greater use in decision making and in government. Again, not for our own selfish benefit to make us feel good about things, but because we believe it really does make the world a better place. And we're very lucky to be supported by 28 universities. A huge thank you to those, our supporters. And of course, our main supporter, SAGE, who also sponsor this annual lecture series. And this is a really particularly special annual lecture for me for 4 reasons. I know that rhetorically it should be 3 reasons, but there are actually 4 reasons, so we're stuck with 4 reasons. And I think first and most important, of course, is I get to chair Julia Gillard, who is, of course, ex-Prime Minister of Australia, current chair of Wellcome and of our Global Institute for Women's Leadership at King's. And just genuinely one of the most incredible people I've had the pleasure to work with. And I'd be happy to listen to Julia talk on just about anything. But my second reason for particular delight today is the subject matter of Julia's talk is on truth and trust and the role of evidence in a polarised world, which is incredibly close to my heart, given the focus of the work that we do at the Policy Institute and in my own research personally. And personally, I'm deeply worried, getting deeply worried about where we are and where we are moving to in all sorts of ways. But I'm also not despondent because we have such a strong case for evidence. As you can see in the latest report from the campaign, the contemporary relevance of social sciences, which is on your chairs, which makes a really clear case for the value of social sciences in dealing with some of the challenges that are underlying and are at the heart of that division that we are seeing. The third reason that I'm really happy to be here tonight is that we have an incredible lineup of respondents in Stian Westlake, who is Executive Chair of the SRC, who supports so much of the vital social science research in the UK and around the world, and Yuan, who's MP for Earley and Woodley, member of Treasury Select Committee and co-chair of the APPG for Social Science and Policy. So together, we really couldn't ask for a better group to look at this type of issue. And finally, my last reason for delight is it's my last annual lecture that I'll be introducing, as my 6 years as chair have come to an end. And just to be really clear, it's not the fact that it's ending that's the delight. It is quite the opposite. It's entirely that it's been such a pleasure to do the role, to work with an incredibly talented and dedicated team. And of course, chairing this event each year has been a real highlight for me, where I've had honour of introducing such a brilliant lineup of social scientists, from Hannah White to Torsten Bell, Gary Young, Paul Johnson, Trish Greenhosh, Mark Easton, and of course our excellent president, Will Hutton. All incredible insights and shows the real draw and power of the Academy, I think. So format tonight is incredibly simple. In a minute, I'm just going to hand over to Katie Metzler from SAGE to give her introduction. Then we'll hear from Julia for about 30 minutes, get responses from Stian, then Yuan for 7 or 8 minutes, and then we'll have time for questions for you. And I guarantee we'll be wrapped up before 8 p.m. for a reception in here. So welcome, Katie Metzler.
Thank you very much, Bobby, and welcome everyone to the annual lecture. So I'm Katie Metzler, I'm a VP at SAGE. I'm also lucky enough to be a member of the Campaign for Social Science Board. And I'm pretty starstruck, honestly, to be in the same room as Julia Gillard tonight. So I just want to say a few words about SAGE. In case you aren't familiar with us, I realize we may not be as famous as tonight's speaker is. So we're an independent academic publisher, and our mission is to build bridges to knowledge. This year was our 60th birthday, and since our very first journal in urban studies launched 60 years ago, we've proudly supported the development of the social sciences. We've also been independent since day one, and our independence is guaranteed for the long term thanks to our founder, Sarah Miller McCune. She actually started Sage when she was just 24 years old, and she recently passed control of the company to an independent trust that's charged with maintaining our independence in the long term. And what that means in practice is that a selection of universities and charitable organizations that support social justice will become our beneficial owners. And by transferring control of Sage to a trust, Sarah's secured our independence, and that means that we're free to make decisions for the long term. We're free to take risks, make investments that advance our mission for the next 60 years and beyond. So the primary way we support the social sciences is through our publishing, of course, but it's also by sponsoring events like this one and taking part in things like the Campaign for Social Science. And our aim is to demonstrate the role that social science plays in helping us to understand and address the most urgent issues facing society. Alongside the campaign, we also publish reports like Bobby just waved around, which we will hope you will all take with you, which gather data, case studies, and evidence for policymakers on the impact of the social sciences. And so speaking of impact, for all of the social scientists in the room, I also encourage you to check out Sage's Policy Profiles, which is a free tool that allows you to look at where your work has been cited in policy documents to help you understand the impact of your work on policy. So a big thank you from Sage to everyone in the audience who supports the campaign. A huge thank you to Bobby Duffy, who has been an incredible chair of the campaign and who will very much be missed. And thank you to all of you for coming tonight. And mostly thank you to our speaker, who I will pass over to now. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much. It's great to join you. And can I particularly acknowledge Bobby Duffy? I'm here because he kindly extended to me the invitation to join you. Now, that's really glossing over it. The truth is, if Bobby asks you to do something, you do it. So here I am. Tonight, I want to begin by celebrating the enduring and vital work of the Academy of Social Sciences and its advocacy arm, the Campaign for Social Science. After all, if you can't get a pat on the back at your annual lecture event, when can you? It was the vision of the founders in the 1980s to create the Academy, and it was their vision to bring together the UK's diverse academic, practitioner and learned societies. And being connected and talking to each other is valuable in its own right, but what's even more powerful is your discussions gave rise to collective action. In January 2011, the Academy dramatically amplified its impact by launching the Campaign for Social Science. This campaign has reached beyond academia and now showcases to decision makers how social science disciplines can directly solve national challenges. And the Academy has successfully demonstrated the power of social science in both words and deeds. I congratulate you for the remarkable agility shown during the COVID-19 pandemic, your rapid response work, including the immediate launch of a COVID-19 hub early in the lockdown, ensured that crucial societal research on everything from behavioural change and vaccine uptake to economic modelling and social fragmentation was immediately accessible to policymakers and the public. This ability to swiftly convene and broker expertise demonstrates your dedication to evidence-led governance, not just in theory, but at a time of highest national emergency. This focus on real-world impact is also visible in your authoritative reports, such as Vital Business, which canvasses the essential role of the social sciences in the UK private sector. This report directly countered the simplistic notion of a pure STEM-led economy by demonstrating that businesses across the UK, from tech giants to engineering consultancies, rely heavily on social science knowledge and skills in areas like strategic planning, market awareness, innovation and risk management. Finally, the campaign continues to shape the national dialogue with landmark publications like Beyond the Ballot. This report represents a proactive, coordinated effort to embed social science research into the current government's missions. If we pull back the lens from the work of the Academy and look more broadly, we can see that in a world defined by accelerating change, addressing the many challenges that arise requires more than just scientific ingenuity. It requires a deep, nuanced and data-driven understanding of people, society and place. But, and you kind of knew there was going to be a but after the words of congratulations, didn't you? Despite all of this good work, we are living in a time of peril for social sciences. This evening, I want to explore the nature of the risks, what we can do about them, and then end with some happier news about what it can look like when social science is really valued. Let's start our exploration in an unusual place, but one which I think elucidates our contemporary problems. As you may recall, on the 29th of January this year, there was a fatal mid-air collision between an American Airlines regional jet and a US Army Black Hawk helicopter over Washington, DC. Tragically, all of the 67 people aboard both aircraft died. President Donald Trump reacted almost immediately to the disaster and suggested that the crash was attributable to the diversity, equity and inclusion policies at the Federal Aviation Administration. When directly challenged by reporters on the source of this extraordinary claim, the President famously stated, "Because I have common sense." Notably, the subsequent investigation by the National Transportation Safety Board did not bear out the President's claim. His terminology, common sense, channeled the wording of his inauguration address given just a few days before, in which he promised a revolution of common sense. The administration has subsequently used the common sense argument to justify freezing or terminating federal grants which contain keywords related to social research topics, including diversity, equity, gender and trauma, branding them as woke or social engineering policies. While social science disciplines are the primary generators of this type of research, we should note the Trump administration has also targeted science more broadly, and especially the science of vaccines. Common sense is a phrase that dismisses the complex, quantitative and qualitative methodologies of social science in favour of simple, intuitive, personal or community belief. And in many ways, all this is just the next instalment in the age-old tradition of pitting universities against communities. As long ago as 1963, William F. Buckley Jr., the noted American conservative theorist and activist, who is often cited as the intellectual father of the tradition that led to the Reagan administration, wrote, and I quote, "I am obliged to confess that I should sooner live in a society governed by the first 2,000 names in the Boston telephone directory than in a society governed by the 2,000 faculty members of Harvard University." But in an age where anti-intellectual populism can be turbocharged by social media with ugly virality, the power of this long-standing threat is hugely magnified. Additional layers of challenge come from the funding constraints facing universities here and in many other parts of the world. We see a trend towards vocational courses and degrees that promise a direct line to employment, even though in a world of AI-driven labour market change, such promises aren't golden. In research funding, there's a growing emphasis on what's profitable, what's patentable, what's measurable in quarterly returns. So the threats are ideological and fiscal. We should note that here in the UK, we have seen a change in rhetoric between the former Conservative government and the current Labor one. Terminology like low-value degrees to describe social science qualifications are no longer in regular use, but acute fiscal pressures remain. Campaign-wise, what should we conclude and do in the face of these threats? I don't have all the answers, but would direct your attention to a useful information source. Funded by Wellcome, last week the Campaign for Science and Engineering launched new qualitative and quantitative research on attitudes to research and development. The findings include the overall sense of pessimism amongst the public, with 62% agreeing that the UK is in decline and just 39% saying they are optimistic things will get better. Immigration is a prominent issue, but the top 3 priorities nominated by those surveyed included the NHS, tackling the cost of living and growing the economy. Support for research and development would best be described as broad but not deep. Around 40% said they had heard of the term R&D and knew what it meant, rising to 82% when research and development is spelled out in full. Initial associations with R&D tended to focus on consumer technologies and medical advances rather than the arts or humanities. R&D was most often associated with the private sector in focus groups, with the universities rarely front of mind and with universities seen primarily as education institutions. The public struggle to understand the scale of the R&D workforce, and although viewed favourably, most do not consider researchers to be like them, and stereotypes persist. Asked about the importance of R&D in delivering benefits for them and their families, 80% said that it was at least somewhat important. Some 88% said it was at least somewhat important for the government to invest money in R&D. And 71% think the government should either increase or maintain levels of research and development funding. But only 4 in 10 said that research and development was relevant to their life, and just 29% said they felt connected to research and development. Around half said that research and development benefits some in the UK more than others, with the main beneficiaries seen to be the wealthy or elite and the private sector. There are troubling differences on voting intention, with those intending to vote Labor or Conservative tending to be more supportive of R&D across a range of measures compared to those intending to vote Reform. Labor or Conservative voters were more likely to think of lots of ways R&D benefits them or their family than Reform voters, 66% for Labor voters, 55% for Conservative voters, and 39% for Reform voters. Reform voters were more likely to think the UK had fallen behind on R&D and less likely to support an R&D laboratory being built in their area. Levels of distrust in researchers were also higher amongst Reform voters. Now, I'm conscious I've hit you with quite a few numbers and a lot of information, but to summarise, what I think those numbers are trying to tell us is that a politically partisan campaign against research, especially woke research, in the UK current political circumstances would certainly strike a chord. We have work to do to explain the benefits of research and especially of the social sciences. the contribution of which is even less understood than research generally. On the upside, I keenly noted the finding that charities, universities and researchers are the three most trusted sources for views on funding of research and development, with politicians the least trusted, which means I've jumped from the bottom to the top by joining Wellcome, so I am very happy with that. If we are to find the right strategies to campaign for more public support for research generally, and for the social sciences in particular, we need to be self-reflective, indeed self-critical, about what we have done well and what we have done badly to date. I'm not equipped to offer that comprehensive analysis for all of social sciences, but I can at least offer you a case study. As you have heard, I have the honour of chairing the Global Institute for Women's Leadership here at King's College London. We also look to polling data. Each year, the Global Institute partners with Ipsos, the polling company, to look at attitudes to gender equality. Our 2025 report was based on a survey of nearly 24,000 people across 30 countries around the world. One of the questions we asked was whether people think women's equality has gone so far that it now discriminates against men. 44% agreed, almost half. And while men were disproportionately saying yes to this question, over a third of women also agreed with that statement. Now, this is not a revelation to us at the Global Institute. We have conducted this type of opinion polling for several years now and have seen a hardening of these kinds of attitudes over time. But years of data shouldn't inoculate us from feeling the impact of this startling statistic. The World Economic Forum research tells us we are much more than 100 years away from achieving gender equality globally, yet 44% of people believe that men are becoming victims of gender discrimination. The bad news doesn't stop there, I'm afraid. Asked whether a man who stays home to look after his children is less of a man, 28% of Gen Z men agree. And that means in our sample, those aged over 18 but no older than 27 at the time of the survey. Among those ageing baby boomers, people like me, only 12% of men express the same view. Now, we should just pause for a moment and have that sink in. It means if you found yourself at a birthday party for a 70-year-old, with the celebrating crowd largely in the same age bracket, you are more likely to be among men supportive of gender equality than if you went to a 21st. Why is that? We thought these younger generations growing up without the shadow of a Cold War and in the age of digital technology would become global citizens, able to see through the stereotypes ingrained in previous generations. Of course, we thought there would still be political differences and varied appetites for the rate of change, but we assumed the trend would be progressive, not polarising. The reality reminds me of a quote by the American humorist and poet Ogden Nash, who said, "Progress might have been all right once, but it's gone on too long." He was, of course, making a joke, but what happened to make so many young men begin to see progress and equality as a threat? No one knows the full answer to that, but there is now a huge drive to understand it, and indeed some of Bobby's own research helps shed some light. This year's acclaimed TV series Adolescence was one way of people trying to get to grips with it, and showed that the creative industries are now trying to help us grapple with and reflect on what's happening. At a more academic level, at the Global Institute for Women's Leadership, we are endeavouring to mount a major research project into attitude formation by young men. It is always dangerous to posit an explanation before all the data and analysis is in, but intuitively I would posit three potential factors. One, young men are doing it tougher today. The statistics on comparative educational attainment and income generation capacity are truly concerning. Indeed, here in the UK, for the first time, it is young men rather than young women who are more likely to be out of work and out of school. Second, today's generation has had more of their gender-based attitudes formed online, with anti-women elements encompassing everything from early access to violent pornography to the incel movement and the manosphere. Third, today's generation likely saw extra programs for girls when they were at school, an understandable response to the then existing educational disadvantages facing girls, but perhaps that has left the boys feeling undervalued. And maybe there is just some old-fashioned acting out against a more empowered generation of mothers who likely worked as well as cared for children and had a sense of their own equality. Wherever the research takes us, as we have already noted, the Trump administration has devoted itself to dismantling diversity, equity and inclusion policies, not only in federal agencies, but with intentional ripple effects on businesses, universities and organisations throughout the world. In a bizarre turn of political doublespeak, equity is being painted as inequitable, inclusion policies as excluding and unlawful. But we have to acknowledge this doublespeak is finding an audience and changing views. I have urged you to be self-reflective, even self-critical, so let me practice what I'm preaching. In gender equality campaigning, I think we have made a central error. Put starkly, we have failed to explain that a gender-equal world will be a better world for everyone. We have allowed the impression to settle that gender equality is about benefits for women, not benefits for all. Yet we know that men also benefit from living in more gender-equal communities. The Global Institute for Women's Leadership launched a UK Gender Equality Index this year, which breaks down gender equality measures to a local government level. We found communities that are disadvantaged but more gender equal. Basically, men and women were both doing badly. We found communities that are disadvantaged and highly gender unequal. Men are doing badly and women are doing even worse. We found communities that are advantaged and more gender equal. Men and women are doing well. What we didn't find is even one community that is gender unequal and advantaged. What this research shows is that when we rise together, men and women, not a zero-sum game, but a virtuous circle of more advantaged circumstances and more gender equality. When we look at the individual level, we also find that gender equality advantages men. Research shows that everyone who holds a gender incongruent role pays a price. What do I mean by that? Well, simply, a woman military commander has to prove herself better to be accepted because the stereotypes in our brain are screaming that we should be seeing a man in that role. But the same effect plays out for a male nurse who has to do more to prove his competence and his caring attributes because instinctively he is not who we expected to show up. Against this backdrop, in the fight for gender equality, I have been urging people to resist, reflect and re-energise. We must resist the rollback of measures to support diversity and in the UK, particularly focus on those businesses and organisations who use the cover of Trump's actions to quietly walk away from their own DEI work. But we must also reflect on how to do better. We can't ignore the state of public support for diversity initiatives or gloss over the errors in our campaigning. And having done that reflection, we must re-energise. I hope that resonates with you. Resist, reflect, re-energise, and I hope it resonates with you particularly as you consider the further campaigning work we need to do in support of social sciences and science and evidence more generally. Now to some better news. I have the privilege of chairing the board of Wellcome, a global philanthropic fund based here in the UK. At Wellcome, we believe in science as a force for good, but we also know that science alone doesn't change the world. People do, and that's where social science comes in. We want to improve health, not just for the healthiest or the wealthiest, but for everyone. So we need to understand the social, cultural, economic and political contexts in which health is lived and shaped. That's why Wellcome has always supported research beyond the lab bench and the clinic. This evening, I want to share with you a few examples of how social science, supported by Wellcome, is making a real difference, not in abstract terms, but in the lives of individuals and communities around the world. Let me start with a story that's unfolding right now, one that shows how humanities and social science are shaping the future of biology itself. As part of Wellcome's £10 million investment in the Synthetic Human Genome Project, scientists across 5 UK universities are developing the tools to synthesise human DNA, starting with a single chromosome. It's a bold step beyond editing the genome, and it's aiming to rewrite a whole genome from scratch. The implications for medicine and biotechnology are vast. Targeted cell therapies, virus-resistant tissues, even new ways to understand how our body functions at the most fundamental level. Alongside the science, we instigated a parallel effort, a global social science program called Careful Synthesis, led by Professor Joy Zhang at the University of Kent. This isn't just an ethics add-on, it's a full-scale investigation into the social, political and cultural questions raised by the kind of synthesis we are aiming for. Through empirical research across Europe, Asia, Africa and the Americas, the program is asking, what does it mean to build human DNA? Who gets to decide how it is used? How do we ensure this technology reflects diverse values and serves the public good? Careful Synthesis is setting the standard for responsible innovation, one that puts social science at the heart of scientific progress. It's not just observing from the shore, it's helping steer the ship. Of course, there is a long history of exploring the social, legal and ethical contexts of this kind of science, of the human genome. A lot of it supported by Wellcome over the years. This work has made significant contributions, fostering more ethical and equitable practice. However, wider humanities and social science fields are often underrepresented. Communities and other social partners were not centred, and their perspectives included only after key research decisions had already been made. This not only poses ethical challenges, it means the potential of earlier collaborations was reduced. So Wellcome currently has a funding scheme open to support more research at the intersection of genomics, humanities, social sciences and bioethics. Our Genomics in Context Awards are looking to shift the focus away from specific ethical questions, often applied at the end of a research life cycle, towards co-developing integrated, collaborative research from the outset. The deadline is in mid-March, and I hope some of you here will take a look. Wellcome has also decided to make a £25 million investment in humanities and social sciences over the coming year. We're looking at 2 major initiatives. The first around social data. You, me, most people in fact, We now generate large amounts of digital data through our everyday activities and interactions, on the commute, in the shops, online. These social data sources are increasingly used in health and wellbeing research around the world. Wellcome commissioned a landscape review published this month on social data for health, setting out how data from wearables, mobility patterns and social media can advance research on life, health and wellbeing, and what safeguards are needed to build trust. So one of the initiatives we'll be supporting is a central hub to advance research and regulation around social data, from wearables to mobility patterns to social media. This is about enabling real-time responsiveness, innovative approaches to research, and rebuilding public trust in how data is used. And then, just this week, we released a second report on how collections are used in research. Archives, manuscripts, and material culture hold profound potential for advancing knowledge about life, health, and well-being. Collections exist in analogue and digital forms, spanning oral histories of illness and care, hospital records, personal papers, visual and audio materials, physical artefacts, and digital traces of lived experience. Wellcome Collection is a wonderful example, but by no means the only one. Collectively, they offer unique and often underexplored perspectives on how health is experienced, understood, and structured across time and place. We commissioned research to map how collections are used and the barriers that limit their potential. These findings are informing our second initiative, a shared digital hub to explore and preserve collections-based research in health and wellbeing. Archives aren't just historical curiosities, they are spaces for creativity and cross-disciplinary experimentation that can generate transformative insights. Both these major initiatives respond to urgent needs. How do we harness data responsibly? How do we preserve knowledge for future generations? How do we ensure that innovation serves the public good? You might also be asking, how do we ensure there are people who can do this work? That's why Wellcome awarded £5 million to the British Academy to support early career researchers in social sciences, humanities and the arts. Their new Leadership and Advancement program will offer training, mentorship and skills development, helping build the next generation of academic leaders. Of course, social science isn't just about health, it's helping us understand the dynamics that shape equality, leadership and opportunity. If we want to build a fairer, more inclusive society, we need to understand it first. That's the power of social science, and that's the kind of work Wellcome sees as essential in our mission to support science to solve urgent health challenges facing everyone. Let me end with this thought. Social science is not just a discipline, it's a way of seeing the world, of asking the questions that matter, of understanding the forces that shape health, well-being and justice. Without it, science risks becoming detached from society. With it, we have a chance to build systems that work for people, not just in theory, but in practice, a truly laudable goal. As we look out at the world, I hope you share two emotions with me, hope and urgency. Urgency because the challenges are real and pressing. Hope because of the wisdom we hold, our ability to learn from mistakes, and the power of research to advance humanity. While we might not yet have every answer, we can all find ways of pursuing change, of resisting the rollback of progress, of reflecting on how to do better, and re-energising for the challenges ahead. I thank you.
You come with me, Yuan.
narrow.
It is narrow. It's
Get out of your way.
very cosy. You come here. Yeah. That's great. Amazing. Thank you so much, Julia. That was awesome. And we're going to go straight over to Stian to get your reflections first, Stian.
Thank you so much, and thank you, Julia, for that kind of tour de force of the good that the social sciences can do in the world. I think just illustrating that, particularly through the prism of welcome and through some of the amazing contributions that social science is making to a just society, but also a healthy society, was really inspiring. So thank you for that. I wanted to build on that theme and reflect a little bit more on this idea of social sciences in an increasingly divided world. And I guess I start from the point of view of the fact that this year, in fact, the last month was ESRC's 60th birthday, our 60th anniversary. We were founded 60 years ago. And one of the fascinating things about kind of delving back into the history and our foundation by the great social innovator Michael Young is that shot through the language that he used to talk about social science was a deep interest, even an obsession, in our license to operate and the rationale for why social science should be publicly funded, as you could imagine. And he was obsessed and spent a lot of time lobbying, first of all, Clement Attlee and then Harold Wilson, who finally approved our funding, with the idea that social science should be useful. There's this kind of wonderful high modernist quote he has, it was in 1965, saying the social sciences will be useful and to that extent supported, to the extent that they increase humanity's span of control. But, this idea that social sciences should be useful was right there, certainly at our origin, at the origin of publicly funded social sciences in the UK. So I think this vision that I think Julia eloquently set out of social science as a truth-seeking endeavour, but a truth-seeking endeavour that seeks to make the world better, is really exciting and animating for us. I think what I wanted to ask, in the context of this idea of an increasingly divided world, is to just raise the question of, to what extent is it right, and are we making a potentially tactical error, by viewing social scientists as a kind of unproblematic fountain of knowledge in this divided world. And I guess I'd start from the observation that the world is divided and social scientists are part of that world. And there is a long tradition of people observing that over time there's been, as part of the increasing polarisation of society, researchers, academics, including social scientists, have effectively become more politically monocultural relative to how they used to be. It's something we see in universities. And obviously, this underpins a lot of the criticisms that we hear from populists and from other critics of academia. And I guess what I wanted to reflect on is what challenges that might cause and what we might potentially do about it, in a spirit of self-criticism, as you enjoined us to do. I start with some, in my opinion, fascinating opinion polling by Luke Trill from More in Common, who did some interesting segmentation of the UK population, and one of his segments that he divided the UK population into was what he called progressive activists. Progressive activists have views probably well represented in this audience and among social scientists. Progressive activists, in his polling, represent about 8% of the population. I've not seen any public polling of those views in universities or among researchers generally, but I've been told from private polling that's been done that this group massively predominates in university settings, and in some ways I'd like to think that's not super surprising. If it wasn't poor research methodology, I was very tempted to do a kind of show of hands poll and see how many prospective reform voters we had in this room tonight. But, in respect to the many great pollsters we have here, I'm not going to do such a shoddy bit of research methodology, but I would imagine that there aren't too many of you who've come along who are planning to vote reform in the next election, even though when we poll, approximately a third of the UK population is currently stating that as their intent. So at the risk of kind of stressing the point, the population of social scientists, we are not wholly representative of the population as a whole. And I think, to come back to the spirit of self-criticism, I certainly see some potentially legitimate critiques made of social science, of ESRC-funded social science, as some of the things that I've been involved in as a result of those kind of things. So to give a few examples, there's an interesting think tank researcher called Stephen Webb, who looked at UKRI and ESRC funded work on migration. Obviously, we are very transparent, so we publish all the details of all the funding we give out. And Stephen went through and looked at all the various projects that we'd funded over a period of years on migration and made the case based on his analysis that basically everything was very much argued or started from the point of view that migration was a very good thing for the UK, centred migrants' perspectives, and proceeded from that kind of point of view. Now, that's a point of view we may have a lot of sympathy for. It's certainly not something that would command universal approval among the UK population. And it raises an interesting question around what does that tell us about the selection of topics. Similarly, Alice Sullivan, UCL academic, who recently conducted a review on the statistics and research data on sex and gender, made the argument that the nature of ethics panels and the nature of forces within academia made it harder to research certain social science topics on sex and gender. Similarly, Alex Edmonds, a great researcher at London Business School, has done some really interesting. I don't think this is his research, but he's been a strong communicator of some research by the McKinsey Global Institute. And again, this is self-criticism because I used to work at McKinsey. McKinsey did some very, very widely publicised, still widely publicised work on the stock return benefits to diversity on boards. And I mean, it seems that it's basically very, very, very bad quality research that still gets trumpeted because I think morally we all agree with the case. We all agree that diversity is really good. But it's led us into this trap where this research, which unfortunately was not very good, is something that's quite hard to drive out of the system. So a few examples of, somewhat randomly selected. I think there's two questions here then. The first is, if we care about truth-seeking, which I think we all do, this is kind of why we're all here and why we all care about social science, are there examples of where the nature of the population that we consist of, social scientists, potentially either hinders truth-seeking directly or more likely hinders issue selection? Those of you who read the kind of harrowing Louise Casey audit on grooming gang research will note that one of her recommendations was around research on grooming gangs. And the point that she made was that almost every local review of grooming gangs said, someone's got to go and do some research into the causes. And the point she made in her kind of inimitable style was, no one's done this research. This is a really interesting topic. It's something where lots of researchers have lots of relevant expertise. But it makes one wonder, was that issue selection problem something that we should be asking ourselves about from a social science point of view? But let's switch away from self-criticism for a moment and be maximally charitable about social science. Let's say that we know that some of these issues, social scientists have what might get accused of groupthink, not because we're bad people, but because fundamentally we're right. There are areas where what happens when you find out more about something is you realise there's kind of an incontrovertible answer. The link between, I hope it's not too controversial to say, the link between vaccines and autism is pretty clearly not there. I would like to think that pretty much any vaccine researcher would say this is, if you've studied it, you realise this is not there. And it may very well be that many of these cases fall into that category of things where this is actually just expertise talking and we should honour the expertise. Let's suppose that is the overwhelming phenomenon that's happening here. I think there then still comes a question that we need to ask ourselves, which is not around truth-seeking, but around our licence to operate. And I say this with one eye to what's happened in the United States, as Julia rightly pointed out, where the effects of the Trump government's current cuts and likely ongoing cuts on research, both in the social sciences, but actually in medical research, in scientific research more generally, have been, I think, genuinely, it's hard to see how that can be anything but terrible for human welfare and for the United States specifically. This is a real challenge, and it's something that I think in a world where, in a political world, in a democracy, we need to reflect on. And I think we need to reflect on it particularly if we're in a world where we are not wholly representative of the population and where the tides of populism are potentially rising. Now, unfortunately, I don't know an easy answer to that. I can think of lots of bad answers. I can think of lots of things that we could do that would appear to solve the problem but wouldn't help very much. But it does feel to me that this is something that we need to think about, partly if we want to continue the really important mission we have of seeking the truth and using that truth to improve society, and also particularly if we want to heal these divisions, which as a part of society we're inevitably part of, but we can also look at intelligently and say that these are bad things. So I guess I would conclude by echoing Julia's underlying point that our mission here is absolutely vital, and really throwing out there this question of how we make sure that as participants in this society, and as inevitably participants in the divisions that go on, how we can make the most of that role, do the best we can as truth seekers, and really underpin our license to operate in a politically diverse society. But thank you.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stian. Really good. I'll give you a chance to come back, Julia, when we've heard all of it. But I think really, really helpful to have that additional frame to this. We've got the resist, reflect, but it also interacts with a sense of license to operate from people in power who are deciding these types of things. And I think that is the tension that we face. Where is it right to resist? Where is it right to back up our license to operate? And I think that goes to a crux of lots of this. But Yuan, it would be great to hear your thoughts.
Thank you very much, Bobby. My name is Yuan Yang. Julia mentioned that she'd gone from the bottom to the top in terms of the trust rankings, from going from being a politician to being the director of a trust that funds research across the world. And I suppose I've gone from maybe the medium towards the bottom. So for most of my working life, before the general election last July, I was an economics and business journalist at the Financial Times. Now, journalists, I know, also have a pretty low ranking in terms of trust, but the FT is one of the most well-trusted publications in the UK, so maybe they cancel each other. Out. I have three questions for those of us who practice social sciences and all of us in this room, which really are: what have we got wrong? How quickly can we get it right? And thirdly, who's in the room? But before I launch into those, I just wanted to mention that as the Labour Member of Parliament for Earley and Woodley, that's the part of East and South Reading that includes University of Reading. So I'm also University MP, and really see the importance of university funding, of public funding for universities, of ESRC funding for universities, and also the contribution of academics from across the world and the flow of students and academics into the UK, into those universities as well. And those are particular points that I'm very passionate about in my work in Parliament. So what have we got wrong? Now, my background in social sciences, from the social science that I arguably has gotten the most things wrong in the 21st century. I'm an economist by training. And before I was a journalist, I used to run a charity called Rethinking Economics, and seeks to expand and challenge the economics curriculum. And I got involved in that because I was an economist. I studied my undergraduate from 2008, at the peak of the financial crisis, at a time when the macroeconomics department, and to some extent the other departments around it, were asking ourselves the question, or in the case of the LSE, being asked the question by the Queen: how did you not see this coming? It's a very complex question, and it's a question that often got booed away by some academics. I think it really is important that social scientists and economists in particular reflect on what we have gotten wrong over the last few decades, because social science does not happen in a vacuum. And in fact, one of the most important reasons, I think, to get an economics degree is because it credentializes you as an economist who can then go into institutions like the Bank of England or like the IMF and make massive decisions using the power that credentialization gives you. So we're not solving optimization problems in isolation from the rest of the world. The problems that we set ourselves as academics filter into the framing of public policy decisions, not just in terms of the outcome of the decisions, but even the questions that we put on the table to be asked by everyone from central bankers to treasury economists to those running the government. And so I think it's particularly important that we keep that humility and self-reflection in the social sciences. And secondly, at what speed can we get things right? Speed is of such essence, as I'm sure Julia knows, in politics. And the cycle of a political term in the UK of 5 years, compared to the cycle of academic research and the pace at which data is collected for the quantitative social sciences is really out of sync. And I'll give an example from a recent inquiry I was part of. As a backbench MP, I sit on a select committee. The select committees in Parliament are the committees that scrutinise government agencies and government policy by bringing ministers and civil servants in front of us and asking them very direct questions. And I sit on the Treasury Committee, which scrutinises economic policy. We recently had George Osborne, the Conservative Chancellor from the 2010s, to talk about the decisions that he had made, along with other former other former Treasury ministers from various parties. And we had a very interesting conversation around Sure Start, which was the Labour government's programme to bring hubs around the UK, particularly in deprived areas, to support mostly, I have to say, young mothers, young parents, but essentially young mothers was the biggest demographic that came, and often single mothers with the health and educational needs of their children. And Osborne, of course, closed down Sure Start in the early 2010s. Now, when I asked him why he had made that decision, he first said the evidence at the time was that it was not a very effective use of money. And when I followed up and asked, what evidence did you hear about this at the time? He then de-escalated to, it was generally felt at the time that it was not an effective use of money. Now, as I think Julia's illustrated with her descriptions of how common sense are used, I think general feelings are often not general feelings if those feelings belong to a very specific proportion of the population. And here I'm talking about the Winchester College Eton proportion of the male population that probably has very little to do, unfortunately, with childcare in the home. The answer to that question about evidence has now been fairly conclusively, I think, proven by the Institute for Fiscal Studies, which has in part ESRC funding, in their longitudinal study in terms of the cost effectiveness of Sure Start, finding that every £1 spent saved £2 in the long run across a broad swathe of measures from health to employment outcomes. And there are, of course, reasons why that takes 10 years. It takes a long time for a child to go from being a child to entering the labour market. So there are these inherent limitations in longitudinal research. But how can we get to those answers at a pace that matches the pace of politics? And particularly in a time when the Office for National Statistics has failed to even produce the statistics we need to answer the current questions, the kind of now casting questions in data. How can we manage to get the data that we need in the public realm when we know that in the commercial and private realm, when it comes to investment banks and hedge funds, a whole swathe of alternative and often very highly predictably powerful data is out there that's not in the academic and public realm. So finally, who is in the room when it comes to social science? And Stian, this is really a reflection of what you said in terms of the bias in progressive activism in universities. I do think that part of that is down to the social stratification that's occurred partly as a result of women's choice, because women rightly have the choice from my mother's generation most starkly onwards. My mother was born in the 1960s, to choose a partner. People of similar backgrounds and intellectual interests and values are now matched together. And the changing nature of romance and the changing understanding of women's agency in romance has also meant that you're more likely to be part now of a family where your parents have a broad range of interests in common. My parents were academics, in fact, and they met at university in the same department, compared to my grandparents' generation, when there would have been more, well, in China, certainly arranged marriage, but in the West, more a sense of marriage between different stations of marrying up, of lower status women marrying higher status or wealthier men. And that has completely changed. And I think that's also had, although it's a rightful change, and I'm very glad as a woman to be the recipient of the benefits of that change and being able to make my own choice, it's also had consequences for the stratification across classes. I think that too often in the way that, too often in the feminist campaigns I've been part of, who is in the room has determined a focus on femininity as the colouring that changes a neutral backdrop, as opposed to masculinity being also an interesting colouring against a non-neutral backdrop. By that I mean that traditionally in feminist campaigns in universities and so on, women are in the room discussing gender and discussing womanhood, and men are not in a separate room discussing masculinity and discussing what it means to be a man. And when I was at university, I was politicized partly by the feminist movement, but I was also part of a group that I called the New Pie campaign, which comes from the quote that feminists don't want a bigger slice of the same pie, We want a completely new pie. And I think that really speaks to the challenge, I think, that Julia and also Stian spoke to when it comes to the polarisation of gender among the young. I've visited over 25 schools in my constituency in East and South Reading, and you can very much see that when it comes to the conversations had at kind of age 15 to 18 range between the girls and the boys in the same classroom. Very, very different conversations around politics. It also comes, the question of who's in the room also comes out in Parliament, of course. We're now 40% women in Parliament. We're still very much have a way to go before we achieve gender parity with the population. But also in the hiring in parliamentary offices, because although there are only 650 parliamentarians, there are many more thousands of parliamentary staff who then input into the decisions and outcomes of those parliamentarians. And again, you see this very starkly. Parliamentary researchers and parliamentary assistants tend to be male. Caseworkers, i.e. the constituency staff who handle calls, who handle the personal problems and inquiries of constituents, tend to be female. And that divide really changes, I think, the conversation around what do we do with this problem? What do we respond? What do we focus on? So I suppose what I would implore all of us in this room today, we often think about those in universities seeking to widen access to universities, or those in Parliament seeking to widen access to Parliament, in the same way that feminist campaigns have often had women in thinking about how to achieve parity with men. How do we reverse that conversation, talk about how the academy goes into the world, how Parliament and politics affects the rest of the world and engages with the world, as opposed to expecting the world to come to us in this room?
Thank you. Amazing. Thank you so much, Yuan. That was brilliant. So I'm going to give Julia a chance to just respond and any reflections on those. But at the same time, if you have questions that you would like to put to Julia and the panel, do start thinking of those now, and we'll get microphones around in a second.
Yes, I mean, given I've had an opportunity to speak at length, I won't do so again now, but fabulous contributions, and an essence in both of them really was diversity of thought in social sciences. I completely agree with you on when we're talking about gender equality, we have women in the room talking about gender equality, and I think that is part of what has led to the kind of campaigning which has only taken a subset of women with us, not more broadly. I can agree with both of those things. I think the hard next question is the how question. How to diversify thought in the room, given that academic institutions, think tanks, etc., are living in a world often, we don't have to tell you this, of funding constraints. You're not in a position to expand to diversify, so you would need to substitute to diversify, and you'd actually be substituting to diversify on a series of grounds that are protected characteristics under equality legislation. You couldn't wander around your faculty going, I've got, 10 Labor supporters, 5 Green supporters and 3 Corbyn supporters, and I need to equal up, so 9 of you have to go. I'm sacking you because you're a Green supporter, you because you're a Labor supporter. You couldn't do that. You wouldn't want to, I don't think, and you couldn't. So the how question when we're in such tough fiscal times, I think, is very difficult. And I think the how question, the school visiting, I used to love visiting schools when I was a Member of Parliament and Deputy Prime Minister and Prime Minister. I always went to a lot of schools, and you get a lot of truth there, you get a lot of unfiltered truth, which is a good thing for politicians. But, to generally for resource poor campaigns, trying to expand and touch people beyond the usual activists that show up has, a time, it's a time sink, it's a money, funding, and how we can find effective strategies to do that, once again in a world of constraints. and where the polarisation rhetoric is everywhere, from mass media to social media, and we're trying to do this very bespoke, localised campaigning. How we resource that, I think, is the really tough question.
Agree. Thank you very much. So, we do have a good 20 minutes for questions, and we have microphones at the back ready to go. And the first question is right at the front, Tom. So come on down. If you can just say who you are before you ask your question, and we'll take 2 or 3. Sorry, it's there. Yeah, thanks, Tom. Oh, we got another mic there. Yeah. Yes.
Hi. Thank you for all of that. That was fantastic from the whole panel. Oh, sorry, I'm supposed to introduce myself. I'm Heather, and I'm from Cranfield University. I work in water governance. I have a question about how social science engages with behavior. You mentioned behavior change as one of the sort of key emerging areas in some of the important work that came out of COVID in particular. In the ways in which social sciences are viewed and particularly trusted, is there a risk that some of the way in which we engage with behavior can also engender some of that mistrust in that? And I have encountered this myself in some of the research that I do, which touches on water use behavior, that it can engender a feeling of being manipulated. And so I'm just wondering if there's given that the importance of understanding behavior, particularly for things like you mentioned vaccine uptake, and the needs around understanding and influencing behavior for real public health aims, for instance, are there views on a way that we can adjust to that new reality in how we communicate behavioral research to the world?
Really good, thank you. A really great question. Any other questions from the room? Oh, we got a flurry. Where's George? There was a lady in the middle I saw first.
Thank you. Simin Dawoodi, Newcastle University, trustee of the Academy of Social Sciences. Thank you very much for excellent talk. And I obviously entirely agree with everybody who was talking about the significance of social sciences and the need for social science research, especially in policy making, which seems to be the main topic of discussion. But it seems to me that there is an implicit assumption that policymakers are actually looking for evidence to make decisions. We know that's not the case. I might even go as far as saying that doesn't always have to be the case. There are lots of other factors that politicians take into account in making decisions. The example from Osborne, for example, is quite clear that that was an ideological, a political decision. They were not really looking for evidence, even if they claimed that. And there is a fantastic quote by John Maynard Keynes, a lot of you are familiar, who said there is nothing that a government hates more than being well informed, because that makes decision making more difficult. So I suppose no matter how in sync we are, no matter how strong our evidence is, we shouldn't assume that the policy will be based on that evidence. And I think the humility that you mentioned is actually quite good for researchers, that they are not the main contributors to policy making.
Great, thank you very much. And Mark, I think, is in the front there. Then we'll go back again afterwards.
Thanks very much. Mark Easton, I'm a fellow of the Academy. I'm interested in the truth and trust thing. So going back to your title. So to what extent do you think that deliberative democracy, which you could argue is a form of quantitative social science, could actually become part of the answer to the challenges around truth and trust?
Very good question. Thank you, Mark. And if you don't mind, I'll go Yuan first and then Stian and Julia.
Yes, I would love to pick up on that question, which I think really gets to the heart of lots of things about the assumption that policymakers look for evidence to make decisions. And I suppose I'd address that by first describing, how do policymakers make decisions in terms of, not how do they do it mentally, but practically what happens. A minister goes home at the end of a long day with a red box, although nowadays often it's Microsoft Evernote on an iPad. They've really upgraded the civil service nowadays. But with the red box in which there are a bundle of notes. I don't know if this is similar to the process in Australia. I'd love to hear about the parallel processes. And each note is simply a collection of issues with a set of questions at the end and then a set of options. So there's usually the background to the issue, set of civil servants who you can contact if you want to hear more about the issue. Then there's a question, what would you like to do, Minister, about the issue? And then there's a set of different options, A, B, C, D, E, F. There might be fewer than that. And the active decision-making can then result in the minister saying, well, I don't like any of these options, take it back to the drawing board, I want you to do this. But I would imagine, although I don't know if there's been research on this, it'd be very fascinating to do some research on this. I imagine in most cases a minister goes for one of the options in the preset list, either because of the expertise of the civil service, or because actually the civil service, conversely, are actually just quite good at surfacing the best options. And unless you're going really far off piste, you're going to choose one of those options. So the whole decision-making framework around the policymaker is not just them on their own. They may be on what I think I and many people in this very well stratified and assortatively matched room consider ideological, but others in a different room somewhere else might not consider ideological. They might consider them common sense decisions. But in most cases, I would say that the civil service apparatus is also really important check and balance, but also framing of options for the minister. And I know that many ministers in this newly elected government, who are the first Labour government, of course, to be running the civil service for 14 years, get tremendously frustrated at a civil service whose options are perhaps learnt under a previous era. So my first point about what economics has gotten wrong is partly about not just the answers that we come out with, but the framing power of social sciences and of policy making as a process. It's not necessarily that the politician is the only one in the room, or when it comes to making that decision. And even after the fact of the decision making, the way that bodies like the Office for Budget Responsibility or the Civil Service or different government departments write their impact assessments, conduct them and publish them, has a tremendous impact on the way that the decisions are talked about in the public narrative as well after the fact. So I agree that evidently some politicians sometimes, and all of us some of the time, in fact probably much of the time, make decisions not based on evidence but based on much more internal reasons. But the evidential structure of the apparatus that we work within often frames and leads us to conclusions, even if we don't know them at the time. And you quoted Keynes, and there is another Keynes quote that I am sure many people in this room will know, but I don't know off by heart, which essentially says that if you don't understand where your ideas are coming from, then you'll be the slaves of a defunct economist or a defunct idea maker.
Right. Yeah. Any reflections on
good questions. I mean, Heather, to pick up your question about social science and behaviour, I think it's super, super important that we ground behavioural science and behavioural interventions in terms of some kind of appreciation of the underlying ethical, philosophical questions. I mean, I think this is something where arts and humanities actually has a lot to teach us. The one slightly mischievous thing I would say is I recognise that there are some issues with social science in these areas. I've observed that social scientists are better than public health people on this, so there's kind of a hierarchy. But I absolutely agree we can learn a lot from people who are thinking about, well, what are the permission structures here, as well as what's the best way to nudge people. On evidence, I think this is a very important question. We've been funding evidence synthesis of various types at ESRC for over a dozen years now. I think my view is that the best designers of evidence, the best sort of policy entrepreneurs of evidence, are good at meeting policymakers halfway. No politician will, or indeed should, purely be making evidence-based decisions. but almost every policymaker will have some areas where within their commitments to their political constituents will be able to do a better job through evidence. So being able to do that and being able to speak the right language is really important. I'm going to leave the deliberative democracy because I think I've got too much to say about it, and I'm going to hand over to the actual democratic politician here.
Well, I'm very happy to pick up that question. I mean, I would say about deliberative democracy, you know, citizens' juries, all the rest of it, we should be trying these mechanisms. I don't know. I've seen some great examples in Australia. There are some great examples. I don't know if the evidence is in that they really do help lift public trust. But I also think we're at the stage with democracies where the decline in trust, the fragmentation, the polarisation in political debate, we might as well try something. You know, just, you know, the status quo, we can see the trend line on the status quo, and that trend line is not taking us in a good direction. And so I think all sorts of democratic innovations are worth trying. And I think deliberative democracy potentials are worth trying. I think parliamentary reform, very deep parliamentary reform, is certainly worth thinking about. I mean, you know, I can't preach. I came up in and thrived in a very adversarial environment and enjoyed it. But I think we can see in the modern world that the public's over it, the kind of you know, sort of rhythms of parliamentary life, of question time, of people yelling at each other. I think different structures have to be tried within the parliament itself. I've advocated in the past. I know the nature of the infrastructure here doesn't make it very easy because it's old and very gorgeous, but consequently not very easy to change the parliament here. But I've advocated in the past trying something like randomised seating in Parliament. I mean, in the Australian House of Representatives chamber, everybody's actually got a seat. It's a little bit different to the House of Commons. Those seats are allocated, you know, government one side, opposition the next, the opposite, you know, some independents and whatever in the middle. You know, if you allocated it at random, I think the Welsh Assembly does this. If you are actually sitting, you know, Tory, Labor, Lib Dem, you know, you're far less likely to be turning and going than you are across where you've got all your mates with you and all the people you're opposed to opposite you. I think all of these things, and there would be dozens and dozens of ideas more, are worth trying because we've got to do a series of very different and potentially radical changes to restore public trust. On just very briefly, a little word in defence of politicians, I think a little harsh, but I would say something about the Australian system, which I'm going to advocate for as a stronger one in many ways in terms of getting options and choices up to politicians. We have 3 very empowered central agencies in the Australian Public Service. Prime Minister and Cabinet is a sizable department full of policy generalists with the ability to pull in policy specialists. So as the Australian Prime Minister, you could say to the PM&C, get me a research paper about the implications of AI for the labour market and the future of employment services, and they would do a remarkably good job at that. Would they get everything right? Of course not, because no one's going to get everything right, but they would do a remarkably good job. They would reach out to stakeholders, they'd synthesise the evidence, they'd bring it up to you. And everything that goes to Cabinet has the contestability. Treasury is more on macroeconomics, finance is more on government budgeting, and you've got the contestability in advice. So a submission might come up and Prime Minister and Cabinet says it's the best idea we've ever seen. Treasury says that's the worst rubbish we've ever seen, and finance says the figures don't add up, and you can have a genuine debate. And the Prime Minister is an empowered actor in that debate because they've got the advice from Prime Minister of Cabinet as well as their own instincts. So I actually, and we have far more sizable political staff. So I would never have been battling with the equivalent of a red box without things coming to me that have got a note from one of my own politically appointed policy advisors about, you know, Treasury yet again has got its stupid bloody cuts out of the bottom drawer and it's trying to sell it to a new government. Don't fall for this one, Prime Minister. Okay, I'm not going to. So you'd get the political advice as well as the civil service advice. So you're not just trapped in a civil service frame. And of course, there are some things that you've got. You would say here manifesto commitments. Or policy commitments or core beliefs. I was a Labor Prime Minister. I wasn't going to listen to anybody run in the door and tell me trade unions were a bad thing. You know, the evidence showed trade unions were a bad thing. I wasn't going to do that. You know, there are some beliefs that are absolutely core. But, you know, in government you make hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of decisions, and some of them are very close to your ideological centre. But many, you know, trying to improve dialysis services across Australia. You know, there's nothing ideological about that. You're going to get the best of evidence and best advice about what would get the best service pattern, get the people who've got the most need for those services in contact with them and looked after. And, you know, social science material would be of relevance to that decision making and would be highly relied on. So I think there's graduations of it, and social science can have a very impactful role for, you know, a multiplicity of decisions that governments make.
Yeah, just on that sort of specific point, some of the best work I've seen on this is by the Joint Research Centre at the European Commission, where they did a big piece on how does values and identity fit into policy making, because you can't deny that it's there, but it also doesn't mean that evidence doesn't exist within that values and identity framework. So it's a really, really good piece of work. I think I've been to lots of events with Julia, and what happens at the end is everyone wants to meet her and talk to her. So what I think I'm going to do is close it there instead of trying to get another round of questions in, because I can just see this developing. And I think we've got refreshments coming at the back, George, so they're coming through soon. So I think we'll call it there. Brilliant question. So I think it's just for me to say thank you to all of the audience, to all of you for coming, to the teams at the Policy Institute, Global Institute for Women's Leadership, and the Campaign for Social Science. And I think, you know, given this my last one of these, a special thanks to Will Hutton as our brilliant president and Rita Gardner as our brilliant chief executive, as well as the team of Steve, Ed, Amy, Sarah. Just a great team to work with that has been throughout this. I really enjoyed it. Thanks, of course, to our amazing panel. It's been such great insight, challenge, but reinforcement of lots of the messages that came through from Julia, which is our final thanks to Julia Gillard. Amazing annual lecture. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Julia.
Thank you.